welcome to the Data Security and Protection Toolkit and SIEM presentation from LogPoint. Today on the call, we have myself, Russell Poole. I'm the Regional Director for the UK and Ireland. And we also have Nils Krumrey, who's our Head of SE or Pre-Sales in the UK as well. So today we want to talk around specifically the NHS and the Data Security and Protection Toolkit requirements. Obviously, the 2019-2020 submission is due by the end of September, and we have now a new release of the 2020-21 requirement for next year. What we're planning to do today is give you an introduction to the LogPoint solution, and then just discuss how that can be leveraged to really help you get compliance against this standard. So just going through a brief overview of what the SIEM solution is and how LogPoint actually provides capability around this. So if we look at the majority of our networks in today's environments, especially NHS networks, we see a lot of information being generated, a lot of information being logged onto specific systems. When we talk about security and also operational side of things, we have lots of different environments producing very valuable information, from our firewalls to our AV solutions to our two-factor authentication environments, our Windows servers, our Linux servers and such like. And each one of these solutions is actually producing a vast quantity of valuable log information. What we are talking about today is obviously SIEM, or Security Incident and Event Management, and how that can be leveraged to actually consolidate these logs into one central platform to give us a clear visibility across our entire environment. The challenges we see today is that with all these dispersed systems and these specific vendor technologies across our environments, we have all this valuable information aligned to specific silos. So our firewall information is on our firewall management, our AV logs are on our AV management solution, our Windows logs are on our Windows environments. And it's very difficult to actually get the information, get access to that information, and make sure it's actually relevant and cross-referenced against the other information inside our environments. By leveraging a SIEM technology, we're able to pull that information into a central platform and actually convert that from different vendor technologies, ways of logging and the languages they use, into a single platform, a single taxonomy, which allows us then to create cross-referenceability across the entirety of that log information, create dashboards, alerts and reports to really give us intelligence and insights into what's going on across our environments, to be able to alert when things need addressing and really drill into that information to do our analytics and our threat hunting across that environment. The other challenges we see, and especially with inside NHS, is the actual vast volumes of data that's being generated in these log files. And it's very, very difficult to actually find that needle in a haystack, the actual true information we need to actually make decisions against and actually be alerted when things actually need addressing. And with the SIEM technology, that becomes a lot easier. So able to actually pick out the relevance and the actual information that we need to actually be addressing in a very timely manner. From a LogPoint perspective, we're actually addressing three key issues here. LogPoint's primary focus is security. We are a cyber company, and it's around giving that clear visibility around security events across the environments, again, to be able to actually be notified, but also to drill in to actually do that threat hunting analytics. But because we're looking at the log files across the entirety of the environment, it gives us this ability to really look at the compliance standards we're trying to adhere to and see how our environment is actually aligned to that. We can pull these logs together and actually produce very clear management and auditing reporting to actually say where our systems may not be configured in the right way or might not be compliant in the correct areas, allowing us not only to report, but also to actually show the right due diligence against these standards to ensure we're constantly monitoring them, so we can actually show and actually display that to auditors if need be. And lastly, LogPoint, because we can take logs from virtually anything, not just from our security environments, we're able to look at the operational side of things as well. So how is our other environments performing? Can we actually produce clear indications and visibility across our entire infrastructure? And this could be very simple. It could be as far as pulling print logs from our print servers to see if someone's printed a vast quantity of double-sided colour paper and costing us a fortune by doing so. Or it could be more complex. We do work with numerous hospitals and such like, taking logs from things like the patient record database to actually provide analytics around how that's being utilised, if there's anything that needs to be flagged up around access to these kind of systems. So again, some very powerful things you can do over and above the standard security things with a solution like LogPoint. So just looking a bit deeper into the actual security analytics side of things, obviously once we have this central platform, the ability to actually have that visibility from a single solution, we have this single pane of glass view, the ability to actually really display dashboards, but more importantly, the alerts and the reporting behind that as well, to actually give us insights when things need addressing, but also the tools and the power to really kind of jump on that and drill into the information, do the actual searching, do the analytics against that to understand how things have happened, what's caused it, what's been affected, and also how we can address that as well. If we look at the UK market today, on average, we have about a 2.5 month lead time between a breach actually happening inside an environment and someone detecting something's going on. Obviously, that's a very long time for someone to be potentially causing disruption inside the environment, but also to be stealing very valuable data assets as well. So with a SIEM solution, this is all about actually reducing that time frame down to days, hours, minutes to actually allow us to be identifying and reacting quicker. And when we come to reacting, obviously we all now have to adhere to the GDPR regulation in the UK, which has a very clear directive around actually having 72 hours to report on any breaches. And this means that we not only have to report when we actually detect a breach, but we also need to understand exactly what's happened, how it's happened, what's been affected, and exactly what we're going to do about that, and then be able to report that to the ICO, to our internal and external stakeholders as well. And obviously, if you can imagine, if we've got dispersed environments, probably leveraging multi-vendor technologies, it's very difficult to meet those timeframes without some sort of central analytics tool like a SIEM and LogPoint. The other thing we like to say is that with any solution of this nature, with any technology solution and security solution specifically, it's only ever going to be as powerful and useful as the configuration you put upon these devices. And this is why we're really proud with LogPoint, the fact that out the box we have integration with over 430 different vendor technologies, and inside that we have all the dashboards and reports and alerts that go along with that. It means that the LogPoint solution is extremely quick time to value and extremely quick to actually make it relevant for a specific customer's environment. On top of that, the actual interface, the way we actually configure the solution is very intuitive to use, very easy to understand, which means once you have these up and running, it's very simple to then tweak and fine-tune the solution to be aligned to a specific environment. Even with all this capability, however, there's always going to be situations where we don't have the right hindsight to actually put the correct configuration in place. And due to this, we actually released our UEBA module roughly about 2 years ago. UEBA stands for User and Entity Behavioral Analytics, and we're referring to machine learning here. So some very clever algorithmic tools that allow us to actually align very clever ways of actually identifying trends and such like inside the data sets we're looking at. It allows us really to actually identify what's normal for our users and machines across our environments. And by doing so, we can then quickly identify what's abnormal. And this is very powerful for internal attacks, for things like zero-day attacks and such like, where we won't necessarily have the hindsight to configure our SIEM solution to specifically look for those kind of breaches and attacks and such like. So with UEBA, we have a very clear understanding what a typical user or a specific user or machine will be actually undertaking on a day-to-day activities. When do they log in? What access do they have across the environment? What internal and external searches do they typically perform, and what servers and internally and externally are they accessing, for example? There's about 300 different algorithms we're running against all this. And once we identify that, it's then very simple to identify when they're doing something that's not typical for that user or machine. It could be that they're logging in at an unusual time. It could be accessing a server they don't usually access. It could be uploading a vast amount of quantity of data to the internet somewhere. When we have these, we can actually then flag that this is actually something unusual and put an elevated risk score aligned to that user or machine. And when we see this risk score increasing to a certain level, we can then alert and such like. It provides a real power for that unknown scenario. From a LogPoint perspective, so LogPoint as an organization has been actually around for about 14 years now. The product itself is actually on version 6.8, which is due to be released very, very soon. Very secure, very stable solution that's actually obviously been in the market and leveraged by our customers for many, many years. We are the only solution on the market that's actually EAL3+ certified. While that's not a specific requirement for the NHS, it does actually mean that we've gone through a very lengthy and very detailed assessment to actually be accredited for use for central government and organisations like NATO and such like. It gives that assurance that not only is it a security product, it's also built and maintained in a secure manner as well. We obviously are on the Gartner Magic Quadrant, and there's vast quantities of information around how our customers find leverage in the LogPoint technology. And please look at things like Gartner Peer Insights as well, which provides great value around how our customers actually and our competitors' customers actually find the investments they've made. Our customers tend to really like the solution they invest in, and that's obviously around the technology, but it's also around the way we actually interface with our customers, making sure that we actually ensure they get the most out of their investment. How do they actually not only deploy, but actually have the right skills to be able to leverage and grow the technology in line with the changes? For me, I guess one of the challenges we see day to day when we speak to potential new customers is that there is concerns usually around the actual use of SIEM. It's still perceived as something that's extremely expensive, something that takes a very long time to actually get deployed and operational, and something once deployed you need kind of specialised skill sets to actually leverage. And LogPoint's really been built from the ground up to address those three things. It is a very cost-effective solution, extremely quick time to value to get operational and installed, and once installed, it's extremely intuitive to use. This is about adding efficiencies, not overheads to day-to-day operations. The other thing that's obviously a concern for many of our customers, and especially for public sector and NHS specifically, is around the actual licensing and the actual cost models assigned to this. There are obviously restricted budgets for the use in these kind of environments, and we want to ensure that the LogPoint solution is kind of available in line with those restrictions. The first thing we do from LogPoint, and we've always done this from the actual very outset of the solution, is that we license very differently from some of the other solutions we see on the market. A lot of those are actually licensed against a thing called EPS, or events per second, which basically means the more data you send to the actual LogPoint, to the actual SIEM solution, the more costly the SIEM solution becomes. And as we discussed previously, those data volumes are growing exponentially, typically about 40% year on year at the moment, which means that when you actually utilize these systems every year, they tend to get more expensive, which means you have to budget for more expenditure every year, or you start reducing the amount of logs that actually go into the SIEM solution. LogPoint's philosophy has always been the SIEM's only ever going to be as powerful as the data it contains. So we don't want to penalise our customers commercially for data volumes. The more data we can put in, the more powerful the solution will be. So we license on a solution on a methodology called nodes, where a node is a machine that sends logs. And it doesn't matter how many logs that machine sends, we just count the number of nodes. It makes it very, very predictable, very easy to actually scope the solution, and it also means that it's actually very easy to predict how the solution will actually grow over time. The other thing, and specifically for the NHS, so we actually released this late last year, and it's one of the three focused areas we put into the LogPoint solution in the UK market. And we actually looked at where LogPoint was most relevant, where we had the most referenceability, and where we saw there is a specific need for this kind of solution. And then we try to align a solution that really fit in with the demands for that sector, and align something both that was worked technically and commercially for these environments. And for the NHS, what we've actually aligned is a fully unrestricted core SIEM license for our customers. This basically gives a truly unlimited core SIEM solution across any NHS trusts, meaning that the solution can actually be installed with no restrictions on the amount of nodes, no restrictions on the amount of data. You can install the solution as many times as you need to across your environment, and there's unlimited users across it. It makes it totally predictable across that contract term to understand exactly that you can use this wherever you need it, even in environments that maybe you wouldn't think about using it previously as well. And we've aligned a price on this based on type of trust, so ranging from £50,000 down to £27,500 per year, depending on what kind of trust you are. And you can see on the screen here a detailed view of that. There is also additional discounts for multi-year purchases as well. So moving more specifically onto the NHS, what we see is obviously lots of challenges, lots of places where a product like LogPoint can really assist. So there is obviously a massive digital transformation undertaken across the whole of the NHS, and it's been going on for a while now. And that's obviously causing a lot more complexity inside these environments. These vast networks are actually getting more and more needed and more relevant to the day-to-day operations of the trusts. We're now seeing obviously the actual EMR, electronic medical records, now being a central aspect of actually storing and actually leveraging data across multiple systems. And every week, every day, we see more and more different technologies connecting onto the network for medical use. And these are actually now network connected, some of them Wi-Fi connected as well, providing different technologies, different log files that are actually coming into these environments, and different overheads to actually manage and maintain the security on those. And obviously, with all this comes increased risk as well, with the increased complexity. And I guess one of the kind of specific points around the NHS is cyber attacks not only disrupt operational things, they also disrupt vital services. It's one of the obviously key areas where a cyber attack can actually potentially be cause life-threatening consequences. But also with the additional information we're storing on these environments, some very, very specific end customer and end user information, breaches of that can actually have dire consequences as well. And coupled with all this, we see, and I'm sure people can relate to this as well, a lack of resource around our network and cyber environments inside the NHS Trust. There's a requirement to do more with less. There's a requirement to actually, obviously, undertake the additional overheads we're seeing by the more complexity and more connectivity we see in these environments with the resources that are there. The last thing that any organisation or any trust would want is actually putting tools in place that's going to actually add additional overhead to their current challenges around resources. And really this is here why LogPoint I think is quite relevant to actually give those efficiencies, make you be able to actually see and undertake more activities using a tool like LogPoint. And lastly, I guess one of the reasons we're here today is to discuss compliance. So with any trust, we obviously have the GDPR regulations, making sure that we have that visibility and actual compliance in place around that. And tools like LogPoint allow us to actually really assist with that, to do the analytics and such like. The DSPT, or Data Security and Protection Toolkit, obviously has a lot of information in there around how we should be managing logs and how we should be leveraging that information. The version that's obviously for this year, 2019-2020, which is due for submission by the end of this month, has some very clear outlines around what we should be doing around log files, and that's becoming more mandatory as we go into next year as well. But also alongside this, we have Cyber Essentials Plus, which I think the original aspiration was for every trust to be compliant by June 2021. It's unclear exactly how that actually stands at the moment, and if some of this will actually be pulled into the DSPT as well, but that's still obviously an aspiration for a lot of the trusts. We see network and information systems, or the NIS directive, also having separate requirements. We will be running some extra information, maybe another webinar at a later time, to really address the NIS requirements as well. And now another overhead for the trust is the CQC requirement, which has a specific cyber element of that as well, which all requires information gathering and auditing against these standards. I'll just pass it over to Nils now to dig a bit more into the actual LogPoint environment and actually how this aligns to the DSPT specifically.
So I just wanted to take some time to talk in more detail around how LogPoint can help with the DSPT, and also give you a bit of a demo of the product so that you can judge whether that would be useful for you and what areas LogPoint can help. So I've taken a look at the evidence requirements, and I've created this little slide here to kind of show the bits that I've picked up on that more or less ask for a SIEM. And by no means is this some authoritative statement. It's just me reading the requirements, as I'm sure you do. There are surprisingly many references to logging specifically, and you can see the one at the top there. That is a requirement to retain logs, and also crucially to be able to search through them and identify malicious activity. So that in itself is almost just a description of what a SIEM does. The power of a SIEM is that you have the flexibility to perform those searches and even alerting on activity that happens. And that capability can be used across the board, no matter what the log source is and what the use case is. And you can see a few other ones here. A lot of requirements around management of users, disabling users, understanding what users are doing, understanding if there is a vulnerability, where did it come from, and how can you mitigate against it, and so on. So that all in itself is a fairly accurate description of what a SIEM is used for, even though it doesn't call it out by name. Now, obviously, there are various different tools out there that you can use to address some of these requirements, and they're all valid approaches. But a SIEM gives you this kind of central place where you can bring all of these things together, and hopefully, but it's more than the sum of its parts. I'm sure you'll agree that some of these might be quite useful for use cases for a SIEM. So just very briefly describing on how LogPoint actually works. It's a product that you get from us, so it's not a managed service in itself, and you deploy it in whatever way makes sense for your environment and your infrastructure. So traditionally, that would have been installing hardware and putting LogPoint on there. Most of the time nowadays, people deploy it as a virtual machine, but increasingly we see customers deploying it directly in the cloud if they use it. It's through pre-built AWS images and Azure images that you can just clone across. Once you have a LogPoint machine, it can perform one or more of the roles that you see in this yellow box, and that's the core functionality of LogPoint. And that's also how you scale, by deploying one or more of each of these roles to handle the workload and the amount of data that you need to deal with. So there is a collector role that will take the logs from wherever they come from, and I'll have another slide on this to go into detail on how you get the data. That data, then the log data, gets normalized, and that's a key part of what LogPoint does. Because if you know log data, it looks different where it comes from. It's sometimes very hard to read, and crucially, it becomes very difficult to compare and to correlate between different log messages from different systems, and that is taken care of by the normalization that translates it into this single LogPoint language, and I'll show some examples in the demo. Also, we can add information to the logs that might not be there just through lookups, and that could be the most important use case is threat intelligence, where we can bring in third-party threat feeds and cross-reference the logs that we see as that some system that is malicious, known to be malicious. And then lastly, we store it somewhere through the routing policies, and that gives us a lot of control over how long we store data for, in what place we store it, and it can be even as granular as certain log messages maybe need to be kept for longer or shorter. And also, maybe some fields need to be encrypted and only accessible for authorized users if it's sensitive data, and that's all done through the routing policies. The storage nodes need some storage provided to it. We normally size that beforehand, so we have an idea on how much storage you might need for your retention, and you can obviously have multiple ones of those. And it also does some storage tiering. So if you are able to provide cheaper storage, maybe you want to move your log data onto that after 90 days or something like that, then you can do that, and LogPoint will take care of that automatically. And then lastly, there's a search head, which is the element that brings it all together. If you had a distributed system, that search head would be the single place that queries all the other nodes and compiles the search results, the dashboards, the reports, and so on. So, as I said, that's the core SIEM architecture. There's one additional element which Russell's already mentioned, which is the UBA, the machine learning, the behavioral analytics. And that is a service that you subscribe to from us that you don't need to provision infrastructure for. So we encrypt the data with a key that is held in your LogPoint system, so we don't actually ever see the unencrypted data, but we then perform the machine learning analytics on that encrypted data in the cloud, so that we can deal with the spikes of demand that you often get with UBA. And the nice thing about our UBA is that it's integrated into the product. There's no great services needed to set that up, because we know the fields that need to go in there. We know what they mean. So it's almost as simple as turning on a license key. So I mentioned that I was going to talk a bit about the sources, because that is another key consideration for any customer. What are the log sources that I need in a SIEM? And it would be easy to say, well, as much data as possible, and it's true in general. But it's also always worth remembering, what are we logging and why are we logging it? What's the value we're going to get out of it? So if you ignore that slightly complicated picture in the middle for now, you'll see a lot of names around here. Those are all packages that are pre-built for LogPoint, and that we have either created ourselves or worked with our customers on. That's different technologies that they are bringing into LogPoint and getting value out of. And those packages always contain the logic to understand the messages, to do this normalization that I've mentioned, but very often also contain things like pre-built dashboards, things like pre-built reports and alerts. And one of the challenges that customers have had with other SIEMs in the past is that they are left with essentially a blank screen, and then they're looking at 40 days of professional services, or starting from a blank slate and building their solution from scratch. And that's okay if you have an entire managed service or a SOC, but most customers don't have the time to do that. So our focus is very much on delivering something that after you've deployed LogPoint, you can use at least productively and get value out of, and then hopefully make your own over time. So there are a lot of examples there that are either useful right off the bat, or you can use as a starting point for modifications that you might want to make. In terms of the log sources that are important, there's a few classic sources that are always worth bringing in. One is any kind of user authentication, especially for DSPT, because there are a lot of requirements on how you manage your users. And that would usually be Active Directory, whether that's on-prem through LDAP or through Azure AD. And I'll show you how that looks like in LogPoint. So that's kind of the authoritative source of what is a user. And then there's a few kind of networking systems that you usually bring in, things like a Cisco firewall or a Palo Alto firewall or something like that. Any kind of web proxy information where you can find out what websites are users actually accessing. And if there are more exotic sources like cloud sources, you can see some there from Microsoft and AWS. I think in the NHS, Microsoft is usually the more common one. Office 365 is a very useful source because it's relatively easy to configure and gives us a lot of information. And also Defender ATP, I think, is getting more important. And we have a plugin for that already as well. And then the sky's the limit other than that. Any kind of security solution, antivirus and so on is always useful. But you see some of the examples in the background. There's things like SAP for kind of business processes. There's all sorts of other security tools, and indeed things like databases and database accessing, auditing and so on, that you can all bring in, always bearing in mind, why am I doing it? What do I want to see? But that's the flexibility of a SIEM, that they can all be data sources and you can cross-reference between them. And then once you have all of that data, and the DSPT kind of alludes to that by identifying malicious behavior, there's obviously kind of the perimeter security and the kind of traditional endpoint security that in itself is trying to prevent malicious activity. And we very much like having logs from these tools because they tell us a lot of what's going on. But a SIEM is a bit different in that the value comes from bringing all those data sources together and maybe building a bigger picture of what the activity is and what might be malicious. So I've mentioned the pre-built packages in LogPoint that come with specific searches and so on. And that's true for alerts as well. And I can show you some examples in the demo. But it goes a bit further than that with two almost opposite ends of the spectrum of what you can proactively do with the data that you have in the SIEM. Firstly, if you've heard about MITRE, that's something that we've invested quite a bit of energy into recently. It's an attack framework that has very specific techniques and tactics on what does a malicious actor perform in a system and what are crucially the indicators of that you might pick up on. Now, if we didn't have these pre-built packages, you could very much build these alerts yourself, but not every customer has the time to get intimately familiar with MITRE. So instead, they can use the pre-built alerts that are in LogPoint and hopefully gain visibility just from the log messages that they're getting. It's always worth understanding what the tactics and techniques actually are and what they mean, but you don't have to actually build the content yourself. Those are very much kind of binary alerts. It's a very specific rule that hopefully won't be triggering many false positives because it is so specific that it's it either happens or it doesn't. And UEBA is the opposite end. It's dealing with behavioral baselines, so things that are out of the ordinary. And that means that you could potentially detect things that have never been seen before. And it might also be able to connect those various dots that I've mentioned that otherwise it would be a manual process to identify and do the searches and so on. So the two work quite well together. And I think that's all I had in terms of slides. So if I just switch to my demo environment, I did want to give you a bit of a flavor on how the system actually looks. And what you're greeted with is a nice and modern web interface that you initially see kind of in this case, lots of dashboards on. That's very much kind of because it's a demo system. You probably wouldn't have as many dashboards as these, but it's a good starting point to get 1, 2, 3 dashboards of all the different parameters that are important in your environment. And that could be anything from network traffic, system status, or indeed security aspects. And in this case, you can see this is one of the pre-built dashboards for Active Directory, which pretty much addresses quite a few evidence points in the DSPT. So by bringing in the Active Directory data, you can see immediately, which are the users that have been created and deleted, who's making changes to the account, is there anything that gets locked and unlocked, and so on. So all of these things that you see here are called a widget. And you can kind of drag and drop these around. You can change, how they are visualized. Not all of it makes sense. That's how you can start building your own dashboards, because you probably don't need 20 of these widgets for Active Directory. Maybe there's just the general activity. And that also already highlights the strength of a dashboard widget. It's not alert driven itself. It just shows you the current state of play. But if it goes over the last 24 hours or even the last week, you might be able to already spot certain unusual things just in the ebb and flow of this data. You can see in this case, because it's a demo system, it's very, very level. But if there was a spike in account management, is that, if someone purging lots of accounts, why is that happening? And that's true for all the dashboards. So some customers have these up on a big screen as the key indicators. Some customers log into this and look at it every day. Other customers don't really care as much about dashboard. They just want to be alerted, and I'll get to that in a second. So Active Directory is one of the big use cases. Another one is just user authentication, which is kind of related to Active Directory, but doesn't necessarily have to happen from the domain controller. On the domain controller, you see certain aspects of that when users obtain tickets and so on, but you might also see something from your endpoints. And in fact, that's always a decision. Do you want to log from your endpoints or not? There's various ways of doing that. It's the only Windows systems are the only systems where we have an agent if you want to use it. We don't have to use an agent. We can use something like Windows Event Forwarding and WIM and other things. But sometimes having an agent, especially on a server where you might be collecting log files from, or you might want to monitor the registry, you might want to do file integrity checking to make sure that files aren't modified. That's the kind of functionality that the Windows agent provides. And then if you have the endpoint logs, that might set you up quite well for those MITRE attacks, which is very much focused on endpoints and trying to catch all the things that maybe a traditional endpoint solution, especially if it's just a virus scanner, wouldn't pick up on. Things like process escalations and pass the hash and all sorts of attacks that might be evident in the log files, but only on the endpoint. And in this case, it's a high-level dashboard that shows you who's logged in generally across your environment, where might they have been coming from, what were the failure reasons why they couldn't log in, and so on. So it's not only useful for security purposes, but it's also operationally quite useful. I do know of customers that have set up proactive alerts when they see someone that keeps failing their password, then maybe they already get in touch with them to unlock their account or something like that, which is always well received if they don't even have to open the ticket and so on. So that's the other side of authentication in Windows. Now, obviously, there's a whole raft of other sources. I just want to talk about two more. So firstly, any kind of network infrastructure is interesting because you can see who's communicating with what and what communication is going on to where. So in this case, it's a very high-level dashboard that kind of works against any network device that you might have. And that's due to the normalization that we have for any log source. But obviously, you could have more specific dashboards. Maybe if you have Palo Alto, you've got a Palo Alto dashboard, because they all have their own little nuances in their logs, but they also all tell us about denied connections from where and to where. And maybe this is of interest. Sometimes just monitor whether there is actually communication between different zones, especially if there was something like PCI, which is probably not the case for DSPT, but you might want to know if something communicates with something that it shouldn't. And that's the strength of SIEM generally. We can be picking up these log files from anything. Not everyone looks at their Cisco logs. Even fewer people would look at their switch logs if someone makes a configuration change and so on. So just by looking at those log messages, that might tell you certain things. And it might not be worth alerting on, but if you have to establish after the fact what happened, you might need that information to say, oh, someone logged into this switch and changed it so that the VLAN was different or something like that. You can see that in the logs. If we have all this data of what communicates with what, we can use it for threat intelligence. There are, again, lots of security tools out there. Some firewall vendors do this built in. Some of it is more useful than others. In terms of a web proxy, is it really of interest which websites people browse to and what categories there are in? But it's something that you can do. More importantly, though, we can bring in these external feeds, and this is not all of them that we support. If you have Stix Taxi feed, for example, you can bring that in, and there's various paid for and free ones like Intel Critical Stack that you can subscribe to. All of that gets imported into LogPoint in what is essentially a long table. And then anytime we see an IP address, we can look that up and we can see, is that something that anyone else has seen as being malicious? Is it a command and control server? And even the country that it might be coming from might be of interest. So you can see in this environment, we have certain IPs that we have identified as being a malware command and control server. And you can then dive into it and understand a bit more as to what that actually means. Hopefully in your environment, this would be empty, but it's always worth having that second check. And that same principle applies to all sorts of other areas. So if you have log messages that have just a window SID in there, that's often a problem. You don't know which user that is. We can enrich that, i.e. we look up that SID, we look at that up in LDAP, and we stamp the log message with what the user was at the time. And then suddenly it becomes much easier to find out everything that Bob has been doing, because those log messages that would have otherwise just been floating in air get tied to that user. That can go as far as importing data from databases and CSV files. So if you, for example, have an asset management database, you want to bring that in and find out what the system actually is, who's been checked out to, what floor it's on. Those kind of things you can just enrich into the log messages, either at the time it gets into LogPoint or even just on a search. And then lastly, again, for DSPT and GDPR as well, file system access is a use case that you can satisfy just with log messages. And not everyone knows that really, because there's all sorts of specialist tools out there that do that too, and they do other things, and I'm sure they're great. But if you just want to find out who has accessed certain files, if you turn on file auditing, either in Windows or in your filers, like the NetApps and the Dell EMC filers, then you can find out what's been happening. And the same is true if you have the Windows agent with file integrity monitoring. You can find that out that way too. So there's various ways of getting through that data, and it's very useful because you can see things like this, who's copied something onto a USB stick. Sometimes that might not be very interesting, but in other cases, if you want to prevent that, if a log shows that happening, then clearly something went wrong somewhere. So that's another really interesting use case for log data. So it gives you an idea of the breadth of information that you can aggregate in a SIEM and the value you might be getting out of that. Also, if you have any kind of other security tools, in this case, Darktrace, which does a great job, just not on the network level, then maybe you bring that in. If you have a vulnerability scanner, that's also always worth bringing into LogPoint. And I think vulnerability management is generally a requirement for DSPT. So why not use it maybe to inform certain alerts? If it's a machine that's unpatched, maybe that's something that you want to know about when there's certain activity on that machine. I did want to dive a little bit into the data underneath, just to give you an idea of what actually happens. So if I hit on any widget, hit this search bar, it takes you into the platform underneath, and you can actually look at the log data that powers this. By doing that, you can also modify and change your user interfaces. So I think that's my VPN, so bear with me. There we go. So that is that same search that we had on the dashboard. And in fact, I can do the same thing. So if I turn that into a donut chart, it starts looking the same. But I can crucially also dig in further. And you can see how there is a search up here that sometimes is a bit intimidating, but it's actually really easy to get to the information that you need. I'll explain that in a second. But what you see here is the raw log messages that are held in the system. And in this case, it was 17,000, and they came back really quickly. This is the raw log from Windows, which always looks quite ugly. But this is the normalization that I've mentioned, where it translates all of these fields into the same fields in LogPoint. So if there is a user, it will always be called user equals. If there is a source address, it'll always be a source underscore address, and so on. That's how you can really quickly find certain things if you do something like, and I don't know whether this works, but if you have a certain source address, that's how you'd run your search, and that's the simplest form of a search. If I show you, if I search for everything, you can see how all the log data comes back really quickly, and hundreds of thousands of logs. You can see that there's still some log messages that look very different, but they're still translated into the same LogPoint taxonomy. Also on the left-hand side, for all these 500,000 logs that we just found, it generates this list of interesting fields. So you can immediately see 84% of these have an action. And the actions for that are this one. So you might only be interested in the failed ones. So you can just click on that, and it builds that query for you, and it shows you all the failed searches, or in this case, failed log messages. So when you have something like this, you can right from here turn it back into a widget on the dashboard, or indeed create something like an alert rule. I just wanted to briefly talk about alerts, because that's always the next thing that's interesting to people. So there is an incident management system built into LogPoint. Not everyone uses it. Some people use this to escalate into ServiceNow or something like that. These are based on alerts that are defined in LogPoint. And everything in LogPoint is a search, so it's relatively easy to create these. And there's, as I said, there's a lot of pre-built ones. There's MITRE alerts that are pre-built. By enabling them, you then see the alert when this activity happens. You can quickly see the incident data. In this case, it was the user target mob, and the value that comes back with it. And you can also dive into the data that's underneath this from here. So by having these alerts, you can be proactively informed rather than having to build your own searches or look at a dashboard. Also, similar kind of concept. If you want something as a paper-based report, which especially for DSPT might be useful, there's quite a lot of pre-built ones. You can see some for certain regulations and some for certain technologies. All of these can be customized relatively easily. There's even a little template editor where you can kind of piece this together and kind of decide how the design is supposed to look, and you bring in your panels and split this up and so on. And what you get at the end, if I look at a predefined one, is maybe a GDPR file access report, which obviously doesn't make you GDPR compliant, but you can get a quick overview maybe of the important locations for you, who's been accessing what, what's the list, and you can get some pie charts in there and so on. And that could be generated automatically every Monday morning for you, or gets emailed to a certain group of people. And then lastly, I just wanted to spend a minute on UBA, which is the machine learning. So everything we've talked about so far is very much rule-driven. It's processing the logs, it's alerting on them, and giving you insight that way. UBA is a bit different, and it looks a bit different. And you can see how what happens is that we analyze these millions of events, and in that we find certain behavioral anomalies where something doesn't behave as usual. In this case, there's 3 actively risky entities. So the models that get triggered are in one of these categories, which are kind of like the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain. And you can see that in this case, the risk went up like it would in any good demo. If we look at what's happening, what's been happening over the last day in this case, you can see that there's a cluster of high risk activity, and then there's a risk score assigned, in this case, to certain users. And if we just filter on the high risk activity, you can see how there's one user that's left behind with a risk score of 87. That's Joshua. And it then gives you a nice timeline of what that user actually performed in this time period that has this high risk. And this risk will always be between 1 and 100. And that's the nice thing about UBA and the way that we process UBA. There's some systems out there where this is an expert score that assigns certain values to, or if someone logs in at 3 p.m., that must be a risk of 12. In our case, it's computed by the models. So this risk score will never exceed 100, and it will be normalized against what else is going on in that system and for that user. So one great example of where this is useful is something like this. That's a nightmare for any rule-based system. What's a working hour and what's unusual for a working hour? And especially nowadays, that's even less possible to create a rule for. Sometimes we used to have rules like if it's not between 9 and 5, then it's an alert. But you can imagine how many false positives you'd be getting. UBA processes this on a per user basis. So it's established for Joshua that this is his normal working hours. You can see he's one of those special cases that always works quite late. So for him, it's unusual to be doing something that early in the morning. But it's still not worth creating an alert just for this, because he's probably just working from home or on a holiday or sleepless or something like that. But it's otherwise a piece of information that gets missed, and that might be one of those many things that conspire to make it an unusual malicious user. So that's the first thing that was picked up, and then at pretty much the same time, there's another unusual event that we obtain from a web proxy log, and that's the great strength of a SIEM. Over other security tools, we can piece these things together from all the log sources that we see. So you can see that Joshua sent 1.3 gigabytes an hour using a post request, and that's a really unusual way of sending that much data because he normally doesn't send as much, and neither does his peer group, i.e. people that normally behave similarly to him. So him sending that much data is really unusual, and that will have ratcheted up his risk score quite significantly. So you can see how this can be useful both for alerting purposes, because you can now set an alert if something has a higher risk score than 80, maybe I need to know about it. But also if you do somehow, either through this or other methods, identify something's going on in my system, you can then use these and maybe look a bit more closely at certain entities and users. For example, you can now look at the shares, and you can see there's a share, maybe not as high a risk, maybe you wouldn't see an alert for it, but it was unusual that Joshua Newman, who we know now is probably malicious, has accessed that 38 times an hour, where other people only access it 1 or 2 times, or even him normally only accesses it 1 or 2 times. So that's where UBA is a nice addition to the regular logs. Obviously, you need to have them, and there's still a lot of value in very specific logs, the MITRE attack logs, alerts, where you can just find certain things that should probably never happen, and if they do, you need to know. And then UBA is an extra layer where it runs this through the machine learning process to understand, is there anything that's unusual and that might not be covered by an alert that I have known about to advance to configure, and instead it gets picked up with these risk scores. So it's a more fuzzy kind of way of looking at the data. So hopefully you've been able to get some insight into how LogPoint might help with these evidence requirements for DSPT, and as well as with any kind of operational use cases that you might have and want to satisfy. I think that's it from me for now.
So just to kind of wrap this up, I guess, and thank you, Nils, for going through that. From a LogPoint perspective, obviously, we're talking about a SIEM solution here. We're really about simplification of that. So how can we make this obviously very cost-effective, very quick time to value? And typical installation of LogPoint solutions around about 5 days to get that solution installed and operational, but also relevant for our customers as well. But I guess more importantly, it's around making sure that we actually provide a solution you can leverage, you can utilize, and you can actually gain efficiencies from. And with LogPoint, it's really actually having that power to actually have the solution to consolidate everything together, but have the real usage of the system. And I guess our key kind of aim with all our customer relationships is to ensure that not only do they buy a solution that's fit for purpose, but also they know how to use it. They make sure that that's relevant and they have the right skill sets. No data limits. So especially for our NHS customers, we have this enterprise license aligned to NHS trusts, which allows you to actually deploy a solution that's not only meets the needs now, but will actually meet the needs in the future as well, with no additional cost for that within that subscription period. So it doesn't matter how your environment changes or grows over that period. There's no cost implications for that. And world-class support, and this is really key as well. So it's making sure that once you have the solution up and running, you have that friendly arm around you to actually make sure you can actually utilize and develop the solution as you change and grow as an organization. And our support is truly that. It's not just around dealing with any issues that might come up. It's really actually able to actually help you answer any questions you might have. So if you have a question around how to run a search or to modify a dashboard or such like, we are there to assist with that as well. And I think, hopefully you'll agree, but I think this does provide a solution that's very aligned to the NHS and to their specific needs, especially with the DSPT now as well, but also allows you to have a solution that will actually provide a use inside your day-to-day operations and day-to-day security. With the DSPT, we have actually created some documentation, which we'll send out after this, along with the actual presentation recording as well. So we have previously written a DSPT value assessment, looking at each of the requirements against DSPT and how LogPoint aligns against those. We are just updating that now, so we have a new one coming out which actually look at the 2021 requirements and just make sure that that's updated fully to actually let you know how LogPoint can assist on each of those specific requirements as such. So please look, we've got a little bit of time left, so if anyone does have any questions, please use the Q&A box that's actually available inside the Zoom session here, and we're able to answer those now, and obviously we are more than happy to have one-on-one sessions either directly or with your partners as well to actually make sure we can address any specific concerns you might have or look at any specific requirements you might have as an organisation. So please put some questions in if you have any. Okay, just give it a couple of minutes. So Nils, you might be able to ask this one. So the first one we can see here is around APT and Defender and how we actually leverage that.
Yes, that's an interesting question. So we've got a Defender plugin that we already have for LogPoint, and we've got quite a few NHS customers that I think are switching towards Defender, and I think that's kind of almost mandated for virus protection. And we've been working with NHS Digital to understand on how that's actually deployed in the NHS, because as far as I understand, it's actually a single tenant, which is an unusual way to deal with an organization of that size. So Microsoft themselves aren't quite sure yet on how you can get to that data, but it's certainly something that we are already in discussions with NHS Digital on. If it's just a normal Windows Defender, Microsoft Defender ATP deployment, then you can already use our plugin. But if it's the NHS Digital service, we kind of work with them on this at the moment.
So thank you, Neil. So I guess the answer is that's fully integrated at the moment, and we're actually in conversations, quite in-depth conversations at the moment with Digital to actually ensure we can pull that back on a trust-specific with the information actually stored from Digital as well. The next question here is around how the solution is actually deployed. So what technology requirements is needed for the solution to actually be enabled? Nils, again, if you can help on that one.
Yes, so I've alluded to it initially. You do need to provide certain resources to LogPoint in order to run it. So that's something to be aware of. How much of that you need is very much dependent on your environment and how much log data you're producing, and also the size of those log messages. So we do have a sizing spreadsheet that we normally work with our customers on when they are interested in LogPoint, not only to work out any license requirement, which is probably less of an issue here, but more on how much data is your environment generating. It can only ever be a rough estimate unless you've already got a logging solution and know exactly. But that should give us enough information to tell you how much log data you generate and what that then means if you need to store it, let's say, for a year, and also whether the resources you need to deploy in terms of CPU and memory, how much that would be. Distributed environments, we obviously then look at the distribution across your sites. What are the network links? Do you need a box locally to cache things and send it onwards, or can one single box hold it? But in the most simplistic case, usually a customer deploys one virtual machine, assigns a certain amount of memory, CPU, and storage to it, and that is the kind of starting point for a LogPoint deployment.
Thank you, Nils. I guess the other thing to say there as well is obviously the LogPoint platform is a software solution. So we provide an image which actually includes the OS and the actual LogPoint solution that then can be installed as a collector, as a storage unit, or as the analytics engine, or all three, or a mixture of those together. The LogPoint solution is very adaptable, so you can break up each of those components. It can be installed on dedicated hardware, onto virtual environments, which is where most of our customers install the solution, or into the cloud, so into AWS and Azure. So it's very, very flexible, easy to actually tailor to any network, and easy to expand out as your organization, as your data flows increase as well. Okay, next question is around installation. So it says, you mentioned the 5-day installation. How does that work, and can it be done remotely? I'll jump on this one, Neil. So what we typically say to our customers is we recommend, or highly recommend, that when you purchase a LogPoint solution, you actually also purchase the installation bundle that comes with the core SIEM solution. That's either delivered directly from LogPoint or with our partners. And this is really there to not only make sure that the solution is actually installed and operational, but that our customers have some knowledge transfer as part of this to really understand how to leverage the solution. And it's really making sure that the solution is actually configured and installed in the correct way, that we leave our customers with a working system they know how to leverage, they know how to use. So that includes all the knowledge transfer as part of that. And the last thing we do as part of this engagement is we actually get the LogPoint support team to actually onboard our customers. And this means that we understand what they're trying to achieve, how they're leveraging technology, but also when obviously you're logging tickets or logging assistance, we can actually provide the best possible support going forward. And it's really there to make sure that you have the right support structure around you with an operating system you know how to use. That can be installed, obviously, we used to do a lot of it on site before the COVID situation, but obviously most of it, or all of it now, is actually being done remotely. And that's more than feasible, especially with remote machines and such like, that you can actually kind of spin up and get aligned as part of this installation process. Cool. I think that's it for the questions that have come through. So I guess it just leaves me to say thank you to everybody. Thank you for your time today. If there is an interest in this, obviously we're happy to jump on further webinars. We're happy to have further conversations. We can actually go through an exercise to really kind of drill into your specific requirements, to actually tailor proposals and such like, to actually let you know exactly how this solution can help. We will be sending out additional information. Obviously, this webinar will be available as a recording as well, and we'll also be sharing the new DSPT 2021 value assessment document. So thank you, everybody, and hopefully speak to you soon.